I'm a medical student and I've worked with several talented and very intelligent children over the past few years, and a lot of them have struggled with discipline and motivation. And this is what I found works for them. So, to start off, it's important to understand that intelligence doesn't directly equal motivation. And the reason for that is due to how a student manages stress. So, what we know about stress is that there's generally two types of stress we talk about. There's eustress, and then there's distress. So let's talk about the difference between the two. Distress is the type of stress we typically know of. This is where things like family deaths, your pet dies, you do really bad in an exam, actively distressive events that harm your quality of life occur. And as a result, you react in a negative way. Now, eustress is less discussed, but it's actually the direct opposite. This is still stress, so it's still some effort you're exerting or something happening to you, but it's positive. So this is the pleasurable type of stress that we often derive a lot of fulfillment and satisfaction from. Stuff like solving a really difficult problem or doing really well on a difficult exam. So the issue with students who are gifted is that they actually don't really experience any of this early on. Instead, they experience no stress. So what happens when you experience zero stress as a student? Well, two things happen. You form poor study habits and you start getting distracted. So why do you form poor study habits? It's because your brain is already naturally good. And so you don't need to form good study habits because your brain's doing all the heavy lifting for you. So you just form poor study habits. And the issue with this, of course, is that it can lead to later deficiencies. So let's talk about distractions as well. The reason distractions become habitual when students are gifted is because simply they're bored. And when they're bored, they're not going to gain any sort of fulfillment from doing all the easy work they've been given. And so what naturally happens is you form coping mechanisms. And this presents typically like YouTube or maybe games or several other less savory options. But in general, these are common. And you can clearly see how this might set a student up for difficulties further on. So let's talk about that. When you have all these issues, this is eventually going to lead a student to distress, maybe in college, late middle school, or even high school. And so let's talk about how distress works. As a reminder, this student, we're running on the assumption that they have intelligence, but poor study skills because they never needed to develop anything powerful, and a reliance on distractions. So as you can imagine, that creates poor results. And these poor results, coupled with the natural difficulty of studying that occurs as a result of moving up in education, causes coping mechanisms to fall into full effect. Again, these are things like games or YouTube or many other options. And as a result, these create even more poor results. And as a result, these poor results cause even more distress, and it turns into this vicious cycle. So this may resonate with a lot of students or parents because this is a very common pitfall. I went through this when I was younger, and I've seen many, many gifted students fall through this exact trap. And here's the solution that I've found to be the most helpful for these students. As you may have predicted, the way to overcome this is to make learning a process of eustress. As it is right now, it's too distressing, it's too difficult, and it's causing a reliance on coping mechanisms. So we need to make it not easier, but more enjoyable and at a difficulty that's more palatable. And so to that end, there are two main techniques that we want to focus on. The first one is the study technique. The way we study often determines the level of stress we face while learning content. A student without proper study techniques, so things that are bad, might rely on things like memorization or cramming. These are inherently going to be stressful once you reach a level of education in which the volume covered per day is higher than what you can naturally brute force memorize. So this typically happens in more difficult courses in high school. At this point, students then shift from memorization to cramming. The issue with cramming is twofold. One, it again increases coping behavior, because if you already know you're going to cram, you're not going to study in a longitudinal manner. And the second thing is, it creates bad grades. Because try as you might, it is very difficult to cram and do well for 6, 7 courses at the same time. And this, as we mentioned above, simply leads to more distress and poor results. So what's the fix? Well, there's a very detailed document in the description for free about proper study technique, but the basis is to start with knowledge. So what I'm about to mention will make a lot of intuitive sense and sound very obvious, especially for parents in the medical field. However, it's very uncommon for students to actually do this in practice. To start with knowledge means to, instead of starting with what a textbook or a professor tells you to do, starting with what you know inherently and then building on top of that. So I'll give an example with kidneys. Back when I was learning about renal anatomy, I found that it was naturally difficult for many students to wrap their heads around various parts of the nephron and how it functioned in its entirety. For me, it was much simpler, and the reason was I started with my already inherent knowledge, which was that the kidney filters fluid and as a result produces urine. And then building on this, I realized that filtration could kind of be thought of as secretion and absorption, and of course, the initial GFR. And as a result from this initial understanding, I was able to develop a very powerful knowledge structure about the nephron's anatomy and physiology. Now, this might seem very intuitive, and in fact, most medical students do some form of this inherently. However, this doesn't come naturally to many students, which can often cause issues. Like I mentioned before, there's a very detailed guide on how to do this process in the description. The second way to improve a student's stress levels to target mindset. Let's talk about how mindset actually causes issues. A student in this position has been repeatedly trained to dislike studying and enjoy coping mechanisms. So let's talk about why that happens. When you do bad in school, despite studying, and of course this isn't true studying, this is more like cramming, but the point remains. When you do poorly, what does this teach you? It teaches you that the effort you put in is not a reward. And then it also teaches you that you might as well cope as a result. Now, what does coping teach us? Coping teaches us that games and YouTube plus whatever are not painful. Additionally, if you do them with a friend, they can even be fun. And I put this in parentheses because this isn't true fun. This is typically a rise and fall in dopamine that ends up putting you at a base neutral level. And so as a result, you can imagine these put together gives you a very poor mental model for how to handle stress and how to handle your effort-reward ratios. So how do we fix this? We have to do active reflection. What is active reflection? This is observing how these mental models are affecting your everyday life and whether or not they're true. I found that the best way to implement this method is to every day fill out a self-reflection template. That's kind of going to give you the impact of this model in real time on your behavior. A lot of students get many cool realizations from doing these sort of templates. So one thing that's very common is that they're able to break this idea of effort doesn't equal reward because they realize that they're actually not putting in any effort here. Another thing they're able to realize is that games and all of this are not actually fun. and they actually just cause further issues by leading to poor grades. And in general, they're able to tackle assumptions and they're able to fix misconceptions. And this ultimately leads to healthier habits. And as a result, it's able to put us back into eustress. So this is the effective method I've found to work for students who are naturally gifted or talented but aren't performing up to their level. Hopefully it can help your students. And as I mentioned before, there are many resources and pieces of information in the description for free that may help you out even more. Hopefully this helps.